I would like to introduce AFSA's president and today's host, Tom Yasgardi. Tom, welcome.
Thanks very much, Nadia, and thank you all for participating in this special centennial edition of Inside Diplomacy. So we are happy to see so many of you joining us from across the country. We know we're facing a formidable competitor for your time, the solar eclipse that is moving across the country as we speak. Speaking of momentous occasions, besides the eclipse, as many of you know, on May 24th this year, the Foreign Service turns 100. As we approach this milestone, we are taking stock of the state of the Foreign Service and also thinking about what the future might hold for this venerable institution and its people. With all this, who better to discuss all these things than today's guest, the Director General of the Foreign Service and Director of Global Talent Management, Ambassador Marcia Bernicat. Director General Bernicat is a three-time ambassador and career member of the Senior Foreign Service. She assumed the role of Director General of the Foreign Service in May 2022. So I want to extend a warm welcome to Ambassador Bernicat. We're so honored to have you with us today, and please feel free to make some opening comments. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I am so very pleased to join all of you as we all look forward to the very historic occasion, actually two very historic occasions, the 100th anniversary of AFSA and the 100th anniversary of the modern Foreign Service. These two anniversaries rightly coincide. And I want to thank you, Tom, and AFSA for working with all of us to make the Foreign Service better and stronger. I don't think we have ever had a better partnership between AFSA and the department, and I am so grateful to be your partner on this journey. And I also want to thank Naja Razika for inviting me to participate in this event. Naja has done some amazing things to advance our celebrations this year. And so, Naja, I'm thrilled and ready to take your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Bernicat, for those words. And so why don't we just launch into it? We're going to ask Ambassador Bernicat some questions and hear what she has to say and invite discussion. So the first one involves, on the eve of the 100th birthday of the U.S. Foreign Service, it is as good of an opportunity as any to take a pulse check. So in your view, Ambassador, how's the Foreign Service doing?
Well, I have to tell you, Tom, first of all, this has, for me, to be Director General is a dream job, and it's especially a dream job to be doing it at this point in time. We're at such an inflection point, I think, in our nation's history, in the history of the world. We are looking today at almost 14,000 Foreign Service employees. Still amazing when you think of, the fact that we serve at over 250 missions around the world and do other things like serve on details to other agencies. To have such a small but really, really impressive cadre of individuals. Over 8,200 of us now are Foreign Service generalists, and 5,600 of us are Foreign Service specialists. That compares to, if we go back 100 years, the first class of official Foreign Service officers were just 633 people. And when I joined 43 years ago, the Foreign Service was about 5,000 people strong. So we've grown significantly over time, not just in terms of numbers, but especially in terms of the wide variety and diversity of skills and experiences that we have brought in. So I'm very, very not only pleased with where we are today in terms of the talent we possess, but also very optimistic about the future.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So sort of veering into your personal story for a moment, I understand you wanted to be a history teacher and before you decided to go into the Foreign Service. So given your, so please, if you'd like to comment on that, then I have a follow-up.
Okay. So the short version, I promise you, is that I grew up near an Army base in New Jersey, Fort Monmouth. And while I was born and raised in this little, suburb of New York City, about a third of our school classmates would change every 2 years. That was the length of the tour of duty for most of the people who cycled through. Fort Monmouth was an Army base. And I was so envious of my classmates who had lived overseas, who'd lived in all these different places in the United States. And I felt distinctly disadvantaged having been born and raised in a single hometown. Now, they, of course, envied me for being able to grow up with the same set of friends in the same setting. So I suppose the grass is always greener. But liking school as I did and wanting to be, and liking history, I figured I would combine my desire to be a teacher with this really growing desire to travel, and that I would apply to work in the DoD school system. One of my teachers had actually worked at our DoD school in Libya, which really dates me, when we had a military base in Tripoli. Long story short, I graduated college with my teaching certification in hand, just as a dip in the baby boom population had reached the high school level. So schools were busy laying off history teachers as I was trying to get a job. I ended up going to a free dinner, recruitment dinner at my undergraduate school, and ended up, thanks to the dinner, getting an interview to and landing a job working at Procter & Gamble. After 2 years of supervising the people who made and packed Top Job, Mr. Clean, and an industrial hybrid, somebody said one day, "Do you realize everything we make goes down the drain?" And that was an epiphany to get back to graduate school. And it was, and the graduate school was Georgetown. And it was from there that I learned about the Foreign Service. So rather than teaching history, I thought maybe being a part of it would be an okay backup plan.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. So given your background as sort of a student of history, I'd like to ask you to reflect on the history of the modern Foreign Service and give us a sense of the then and now. What are some of the biggest changes the service has seen in your experience?
Yes, I'm a fan of our being every place we can be, the universalist approach. But if you consider the history of the Foreign Service, the few posts we did staff at the time were all pretty much expeditionary. The minute you got on a boat and left the shores of the United States, you were really on your own. You had your letters of instruction, but pretty much any correspondence, any guidance was oftentimes far enough away in time and distance that you had to be able to think on your feet. I think one of the common threads we have throughout all this time is that we still require that of our Foreign Service personnel, that they are able to think, act, and make good decisions without necessarily being able to call home, even though calling home is a lot easier than it used to be, certainly even easier than when I first joined the Foreign Service. And it's true that we still face expeditionary challenges, most recently in opening the additional posts in the Pacific, our Pacific Island posts. But even when we go in and either repopulate or have to change the way we work, I'm thinking of Iraq right now and Afghanistan. We're not in Afghanistan, but we do have an affairs unit. We find ourselves having to be expeditionary in different ways. I think as well, all of the traditional challenges of diplomacy have followed us into the 21st century. But certainly as the last 5 or 6 years have taught us, we also have to develop a means by which we can track issues that have not traditionally been part of diplomacy. I'm thinking in terms of emerging technology. 5 years ago, no one in this building was talking about AI. We're about to have our own custom-built chat GPT for inside the State Department by this summer at the latest. Similarly, our work on multilateral diplomacy, while that is not new, our reliance on how we build coalitions in what has become in many ways a more multipolar world will require a much greater expertise there. And health, who would have thought that a pandemic would have presented challenges to our national security and to our economic security the way COVID-19 did. So we have two new bureaus, one for emerging technology and one for health, that look at the diplomatic aspects of those issues.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excuse
To follow up also on the question about the lessons learned, as we reflect on the past and the future, what lessons have we learned over the past 100 years in being a diplomat and representing the United States abroad, and sort of the changes that have changed our view of that?
Two major ones that I can think of off the top of my head include we have learned over time to be far more agile. I think people who sort of see those pictures of our predecessors, even before and during World War II, sort of sitting around stately rooms having discussions, that still happens, of course, but we are so much more field forward than we used to be. And the responses to crises are demanding that we find ways to be even more agile. And so I think that agility, which is one of the main pillars of Secretary Blinken's Modernization Agenda, are pushing us further and faster to be more agile. The other thing, and Tom, you talk about this a lot as well, and that is how we are, and the Secretary as well talks about how we are not just simply diplomats out there on our own. We are supported by our families who are with us at post, and sometimes families who are back here in Washington. But I think we've gotten much better over time by learning and living through crises, how important it is to have our families with us, not just in times of crises, but our family members bring a wealth of experience who we are learning to employ more creatively and again, more flexibly to augment what is a constant staffing gap. And so whether they're supporting us in our primary roles or whether they are playing their own roles, I think we've learned to value what our family members bring to the job that we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you for that comment. So we've seen some, even now up to date, today's current state of affairs at the State Department, a number of changes, and some of them are pretty significant, and I would say even groundbreaking. I'm talking about the change in the Foreign Service Officer test in the officer assessment, which from what we hear is going to go virtual next month. And the institutionalization, I would call it, of diversity, DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accountability, or accessibility. So I'd like you to, if you could comment on that as well. You're right, we've seen over the course of decades changes, but we've also seen some pretty significant changes, I would say, even in the last few years.
Yes, and I have to tell you, I continue to thank Carol Perez, my predecessor, who I think really got the ball rolling at a time when you might not have thought there was a lot of latitude to make changes, but she really questioned a lot of the traditions and the way we had been doing things. And one of the reforms she set in motion, without, I think, naming it by name, ended up being the way we assess people who are interested in coming in as Foreign Service generalists. We still have a written exam, but we came to realize that, like every standardized test, there are some inherent biases that we worked hard to get rid of. But in fact, we finally asked the right question. One brilliant person on our team here asked the question, but are we really looking for people who can take tests well? Is that really a core skill that we need in the Foreign Service? And of course, the answer was no. We haven't done away with the test. It's still a very important component, but rather than making it the first, if you will, hurdle to overcome, we have now taken that score, plus the essays that applicants write, known as the QEPs, and whatever background and experience and skills our amazing applicants are bringing to the table. And we look at the whole person, if you will, and what they're bringing to us to decide who should advance to the Foreign Service assessment, which we used to call the orals. I really like that approach in that it doesn't favor you simply for being a good test taker, but rather also makes sure that we're giving due weight right from the beginning to foreign language skills, having lived and worked overseas, any number of other skills and experiences that our applicants bring to the table, to make sure that we're not losing them simply because someone may not score as high on a written test. And then, as you point out, we are taking a leap that we took during COVID with our Foreign Service specialists to having everyone take the assessment now in a fully virtual format. We know we can adequately test for those characteristics we need. And in fact, by taking the assessors out of the room, so to speak, well, the assessors and the test takers out of the room, we're finding that our test takers can concentrate on the tasks ahead of them. And so the three components of that test, the case management exercise and the structured interview, those two have been done virtually for some time now. It's the group exercise that we have finally adjusted to the virtual format. And those who took the written exam this winter will be the first later this month and next month to have to be fully assessed online in the virtual environment. We found, by the way, that even before COVID, a number of people felt as though if they didn't come to Washington to do their assessment locally, rather than in the assessments that we moved around the country every year before COVID hit, that somehow there would be an inherent bias against them, so that they had to come to Washington. Well, imagine the number of people who can't afford to come to Washington and or just even, can't afford to take that much time away from work. By offering everyone the assessment virtually, we are eliminating, again, another barrier to making sure that we're getting the best and brightest candidates we can. And then finally, the other thing that really excites me is the fact that we are the first federal agency to offer all of our internships on a paid basis. Again, the ability to come here to Washington and participate in either an internship here in Washington or overseas was out of reach for so many people. Now we pay the round trip fare, we pay a salary, and if you're overseas, we provide housing. If you're here in Washington, we provide housing, because otherwise I think the salary would be completely eaten up in rents. So we take all of that out of the calculation so that, again, we can get the most competitive candidates to come here, try us on for both the Foreign Service and the Civil Service, as well as we get a chance to see what their skills are. So I'm very excited about not only those two innovations, but the fact that they are widening our ability to ensure that we're getting the best candidates possible.
Thank you. And I might add that on the paid internships, AFSA was a strong proponent of that because it really does make a difference. And it really is sort of levels the playing field so that we have a much wider, let's say, aperture of getting talent into the Foreign Service. So absolutely, we support that 100%.
And I'm sure, Tom, without AFSA's support, we would have never gotten the funding from Congress to make it a reality. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Ambassador, you mentioned going back to the Secretary's modernization agenda. I'd like you to speak a little more about that, especially in light of our diplomats and development professionals getting the grounding and skills needed to face these challenges, these new challenges that you mentioned, whether they're climate change or cybersecurity or information technology and how that's used, artificial intelligence. There's just a whole host of these issues that are pretty recent. So how does the modernization agenda sort of make certain that our diplomats have the skills, these new skills, let's call it new skill sets they need to be successful and promote our interests abroad?
Yes. Well, we have to start with recruitment and hiring. We had by the summer of 2022 a deficit of 27% in the Foreign Service alone. And I have to tell you, some of that was a result of the hiring freeze in the previous administration. When we did start hiring, we were hiring at less than robust rates. And President Biden made it clear he wanted to strengthen the foreign affairs workforce. And so we have been hiring faster than, again, any other federal agency. And we have the results to show. I just swore in an orientation class, which has tied in the record with the last 3 classes before it in being the largest class we've taken in. We're bringing in generalists and specialists together now, where they begin their orientation together and then branch off for the different trainings that each one needs. But to give you a sense of how much hiring we've done, and I use March of 20 as the benchmark because that's when we went into quarantine, if you will, as a nation. But 21% of all serving Foreign Service personnel today have been hired since March of 2020. So we are a very young service, seniority-wise, even as our average entry age has ticked up slightly to 36, not by design, but by, that's the quality of people we're getting and the number of people who have prior experience who are coming to us. But of course, the skills they walk into the building with are not sufficient, as you alluded to. And so we've partnered with FSI on how do we expand the amount of training that's available, as well as change the culture surrounding training. So we started with getting from Congress additional full-time equivalent positions to support a bigger training float. So to go well beyond foreign language and the details that we're currently offering to, let's say, do university training or attend one of the war colleges. And we opened it to bureaus, particularly those who are working in one of the secretary's designated priority areas, and invited them to either expand or help set up new details that are available. And by the way, we also expanded or introduced for the first time ever a training float for our civil service colleagues so that they too are have the opportunity to gain either gain or deepen their knowledge in the areas that we need them to. FSI is busy expanding its course offerings, particularly for some of the less traditional subject matter like cyber and STEM issues and health and climate expertise, clearly issues that are going to be with us for some time to come. We also looked at what would someone in the mid-level need in terms of training and exposure in order to tee them up successfully, not only to lead as a mid-level employee, but also to be competitive to get into the senior service. And so FSI developed, and we worked with them on launching a mid-level training curriculum, a series of courses beyond mandatory training, right? Our leadership training remains mandatory, but this was a suite of courses that, regardless of what your career track is, you could pick different courses from that curriculum to help build your skills to becoming a more senior employee, taking on more responsibilities. But we knew we couldn't just offer more training. We also had to help change the culture. Too often people think of training as a wasted year, in that it's a year they don't have information to add to their EERs that will make them more competitive for promotion. And so we introduced two things, actually. One is a learning policy, which urges supervisors to provide at least 40 hours a year of training time for their staffs. I always say, just expand it out to an hour a week, make it 52 hours in the year, where people can either delve into a new subject matter, they can use all 40 hours in one swoop to take a course they might not otherwise get to take. They can use it to attend seminars in town or virtually, but the idea being some prize time dedicated to voluntary learning that not only helps you expand your skills, but also has the added advantage, and this is a best practice in the private sector, of taking you away from the daily grind of your work and giving you a chance to sit back, relax, and in a stress-free environment, take on some additional learning. Finally, the other innovation we have is that we have brought back multifunctional promotions. Those of you who have been in the service long enough, or who were in the service earlier, you know that we would reward our generalists with promotions, not just for doing great work in their particular career track, like political officer or management officer, but also if they were displaying the broadest set of skills across all of the career tracks. And now we've brought that back, but our officers will compete within each of their skill codes for those opportunities. And one of the activities that will count towards a multifunctional promotion will be having taken a year or two off to do long-term training. We want to give people some reward right up front, if you will, for taking time out of their career to expand their knowledge base. So we're very excited. I know it involves a culture change, but if we don't learn, if we don't keep adapting, as the secretary has pointed out, we're going to find it increasingly difficult to do our work in such a dynamic world as we're living in today.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think we all definitely agree with that. So now I'm going to ask you to shift gears a little bit. Looking forward to the future of the Foreign Service, what change do you hope to have in place in the coming years, whether it's 10 years, 25, 50 years, or beyond, for the Foreign Service to continue to be successful? What do we need? Of course, you've mentioned some of the from the Modernization Agenda, things that new skill sets we need to develop, and the focus on learning, which I think we all agree with. But what else do we need besides that in order for our Foreign Service to be successful in the future going forward?
Well, let me start with something that we've done episodically my entire career, and we are working on it really assiduously under the direction of both President Biden and Secretary Blinken. But that is to make sure that we are bringing in the most diverse set of employees we can. I point out all the time, we recruit for diversity, meaning I want to go to every corner of the country. I want to go to every spot overseas, wherever Americans are, to, one, teach them about the Foreign Service. We remain a horribly a real enigma to so many people. I often say, if I'm talking to someone on the outside and they ask, what do? I say, I work for the State Department. And they say, oh, which state? And I have to say all of them. There is a US State Department. So we want to raise awareness, but also spark the imaginations, both of adults, but also of students, that they too can represent their country overseas, as well as serving here in Washington as a civil service employee. But we always choose on merit. I figure the wider my net, the more people I bring in, the more I can take advantage of what is this country's comparative advantage, bar none, and that is our diversity. How do we work in the world? That is our mandate as the State Department. How do we understand what's going on in the world if we cannot look at the world and understand the world through as many different perspectives as we can bring to our tables? So I want us to be an inclusive employer, again, always on merit, but making sure that we're gathering the widest possible and most diverse set of employees. And that's from every aspect. Surely our race and our gender play huge roles in forming our worldview, but so does where we grew up. So does the schools we attended. So does our birth order. Did we come from a family of 10 kids or were we only children? All of those aspects of our diversity provide the kind of agility that we're going to need, again, ever increasingly in the future as the world becomes smaller. Technology is also, when I look ahead, I will be revealing perhaps to your audience how old I am, in that when I joined the State Department, there were no cell phones, there were no computers, there were no fax machines. And that's just in the course of my 40+ year career. It took us a long time to develop those technologies. AI, again, something we weren't even talking about. We're about to have our own version of generative AI that we can use within the building. So the changes are coming faster all the time. How we manage that knowledge, which again is far more than any one person can digest or even catalog for future uses. So I see the use of knowledge and the use of technology in harnessing that knowledge as something that, again, I can't even imagine where we'll be a year from now, much less in 50 years, but I'm confident technology will play a huge, huge role.
Thank you. And one last question before we go to the Q&A from the audience. So what do you wish every American understood about the Foreign Service? And follow-up to that is, what could we do collectively? Collectively could we do better when it comes to raising awareness among the American public about what the Foreign Service does and why it is so vital?
Again, under the rubric of best kept secret, your chances of understanding what the Foreign Service is increases significantly if you travel overseas and unfortunately something bad happens to you. You are the victim of robbery or disease, or heaven forbid, you or someone loses their life. There is a Foreign Service officer and a whole community of support at that post and back in Washington to help people through those crises. But what we do day to day, I'm just floored. The amount of time, the amount of personal sacrifice. I've lost colleagues in the line of duty. I've lost colleagues simply because they were serving in a country where there was not an EMT service or an emergency room that, where they could be treated. And yet we're there for the American people, working in 1,000 unremarkable ways that lead up to the kinds of victories that our president, our secretary, and others can achieve because our colleagues, Tom, yours and mine, were out there in the field doing their work. To be honest, pop culture is one of the best ways to get the word out. We have suffered through, I think, a number of different movie roles in which too often the Foreign Service is portrayed as, or a particular Foreign Service officer is portrayed as nefarious or cowardly. I think Argo did a lot to turn that around in terms of, the dangers we face. Madam Secretary wasn't bad, though. You'd think everything that happened in the Secretary's suite that the State Department did. The Diplomat is closer still. My goal, if I can add a personal, is that we have Aaron Sorkin do a series on this. I think if he could do for the State Department and the Foreign Service in particular what he did for people understanding what goes on inside of a White House, I think we will have hit a sweet spot in helping people understand what it is we do. I urge all of our colleagues, active duty and retired, don't stop talking about us. Go to your own organizations, volunteer to talk at other organizations, and certainly in our schools, to explain what it is that we do and how we do it. I'll end with an anecdote. I was the Nepal desk officer when there was not the most recent devastating earthquake, but an earlier one. This would have been in, I think it was 1987, maybe 86. And I was working very hard. Everyone, it seemed, who had ever gone to Nepal was calling the State Department to find out how people were doing in general, or how someone specific that they had met, had fared. And it was about 7 p.m. and a woman called, and I picked up the phone and answered Nepal desk. And she said, "Oh, I didn't think there'd be anyone there." And thinking about it. And I said, your tax dollars at work, ma'am. How can I help you?" And I think for everyone who thinks of bureaucrats as lazy or not involved or what have you, if they could only see what our private promotion board members see and what some of our citizens see, they would realize how much value they get for their tax dollar out of the State Department in general and the Foreign Service in particular.
Thank you so much for that response. And now we're going to turn to the audience questions. AFSA staff has been collecting and curating these questions. So let me turn it over to, again, thank you again for that, Ambassador Bernicat. Now I'll turn it over to Nadja to walk us through those questions. Thank you.
Thank you both for that excellent discussion. The questions have been coming in fast and furiously. So we do have a lot of questions. We have about 15 minutes left, and I will try to get through as many as I'd promised. So let's start off with this one. It comes from someone who is a public high school teacher in the audience. And it says, "I note that many high school students graduate without an understanding of the world and why the US must remain engaged with the world. They're teaching a new course in international relations and finding that students are keenly interested in learning more. Would the State Department ever consider having a program similar to the Senate Page program, whereby high school students could be selected to come to Washington and work in diplomatic offices? I would be interested in any suggestions that you would have for broadening exposure to the Foreign Service to my high school students."
Oh my goodness, I love that idea. Thank you so much for the question. We have recently, in fact, I just approved an initiative. I have recruiters who are positioned around the country called Diplomats in Residence. And an idea that they've come up with on their own is to work with colleges and universities that they recruit from to develop a series of courses, or identify a series of courses that would help prepare their students for a career in foreign policy. And that they have proposed a certification program that would help incentivize schools to not only develop these courses or keep these courses in their catalog, but also to promote them to their students for that reason. Wouldn't it be great to have that sort of a certification at the high school level or even the middle school level? But in terms of the internship, again, I was an intern, and when I came home from the end of that summer, I wanted a career here. I said, "Sign me up." And we're finding that a lot of people, a lot of private sector companies are recruiting out of high school. So by focusing on colleges, we are starting too late. Part of it is funding. So I'm looking at you, Tom, thinking, how can we go back to Congress together and lobby for funding? I would love to do something like that. And as you point out, Congress has paved the way. So we only need to build on a success rather than prove the concept.
You have a willing partner in AFSA to do that. That's for sure.
I knew it. I knew it.
Hear, hear. Okay, so switching gears a little bit, and these questions, our audience is wide and varied, so we will have questions that reflect that. So switching gears to talk about foreign service members inside. So you talk about hiring, but let's talk about retention. What is being done to retain the foreign service members who are already obviously in active duty?
Yeah,
How is
thank you.
GTM tackling this issue?
Yes. So thank you for that question. Historically, the State Department has had very low attrition rates. Currently, we have the third lowest attrition rates in the US government, and that's for both Foreign Service generalists and specialists and our civil service. The rates are slightly higher the highest for civil service, but our Foreign Service attrition rate is only about 3%, which is almost attrition for retirement, if you will. But when Secretary Blinken came to office, he asked, but who's leaving and why? Which was the exact right question. We pretty much had been resting on our laurels. But because of his question, we set up a retention unit, which began actively interviewing on a voluntary basis people who were leaving the department at whatever stage in their career, as well as filling out a survey. And then we added to those two pieces of research for people who were leaving and why they were leaving, a questionnaire that we called the Stay Survey, which really was trying to tease out, why do people stay? Because we certainly don't want to fix anything that's not broken. From all of these efforts, this is what we have found. For our civil service employees, it's almost always a perceived lack or a lack of professional development. So in addition to the training float I mentioned earlier, we are developing a number of different exchange programs and other development opportunities that our civil service employees can avail themselves of, including serving overseas in an embassy or a consulate, because they too should understand what our work is like overseas in order to better support that work from back here in Washington. For the Foreign Service, we found that there tended to be no one particular issue, but we were able to track that our attrition rates were almost identical for men and women until about the 10-year mark. When people reached their 10th anniversary, for about 2 or 3 years, the attrition rate would significantly increase for women. And to be honest, among women, the highest attrition rates are among women of color. So we've been researching why is that, but there are some things about in our society writ large that COVID actually exaggerated that we know are at play here. At about the 10-year mark, many of our employees are being sandwiched, as this phrase goes, between taking care of or preparing to put children through college, while also beginning to take care of parents who are starting to age or becoming frail. And we think that for some of our employees who are from our historically underrepresented groups, that they may also come from families where there is less accumulated wealth or wherewithal. And so they were also being sandwiched by maybe siblings or other near relatives who also needed support. And it's at that time, it's not that people walk away necessarily on their own, but it's at that point that the Googles and the Microsofts of the world come along and offer much higher salaries. And quite frankly, you don't come to work for the government if you want to get rich. We earn very, very competitive salaries, don't get me wrong, but rich and very lucrative salaries we don't earn. And so, but we have found that a number of people who went off and took those private sector jobs are having buyer's remorse. And so we've stepped up our program that allows people to come back into the Foreign Service and be reappointed, because even though the salary was a lot greater, conditions of work, and most importantly, our employees in a host of different surveys continue to say that they believe in our mission and they believe that what they do contributes in a meaningful way to that mission. I couldn't create that. And so that is our real key advantage, I think, in why so many people come and then stay with us, because what we do is pretty unique, and both in terms of the skills we employ, but also the issues that we get to work on, the kinds of help we get to provide.
Well, could you tell us about the hiring plans through 2025? How do they square with the recently announced budget cuts that affect overseas staffing and staffing in the department?
Yeah, again, that's a really tough issue. We have found that, excuse me, because the budget came to us almost at the mid-year point, that in fact, the cut in realistic terms is closer to 7%. We just met last week to look at our hiring numbers, and we have a leadership. Again, remember, we got into a deficit of staffing the last time we slowed hiring. And so our leadership is dedicated to putting a much smaller set of resources, thanks to the new budget, to hiring. So we are committed to continue to hire above attrition, but it will slow somewhat. So those historically large numbers of employees I just mentioned, we'll bring in a robust Foreign Service class in July, but then our September class will be considerably smaller, maybe half that number. We bring in about 220 people at a shot. So the September class will be lower than that. That will still keep us above attrition. Were we able to keep up the current pace of hiring, we wouldn't expect to be at parity before the end of calendar year 26. So now we're probably looking at not reaching parity again if we aren't required to take any smaller budget amounts. We won't hit parity until 27 sometime.
Speaking about recruitment and the varied skill sets, what are we doing to recruit talent from science, academia, engineering? You mentioned people are not signing up for great lucrative salaries in the government. So what are we doing to be able to bring them into the fold for those much needed skills?
So we're looking at things from a couple of different standpoints. For our IT specialists who have to keep our communication systems operating in some pretty grueling environments where the electricity is predatory, where there is dust and humidity and all kinds of other environmental factors, we're looking at bringing people in at the, straight out of undergraduate school. And we have various fellowship programs, including one for IT specialists, where we will pay for a graduate degree in exchange for a certain number of years of service. But we're also recognizing that people may want to come and work for us for a short period of time, and then take those skills, that experience of working in a challenging environment, back out into the private sector. So maybe we don't need to have someone come and stay for a 20-year career. For the need to attract people with STEM sciences backgrounds who wouldn't even think to look at the State Department, we've really stepped up our recruitment efforts, including the secretary, who has appeared at Stanford and Purdue and other schools with really strong STEM programs, to make the case directly to students of not only why we need their skill sets, but the fact that we are looking to bring them in and join us. Congress has also asked us to reinstitute what's called a lateral entry program, and we have focused that program. It's a 5-year pilot, but in this first year, we have focused looking for people who are at their mid-career points, but who are steeped in these areas. So things like emerging technology, particularly artificial intelligence, climate and the environment, energy issues, bringing them in at the mid-level in small numbers, about 50 people in the first 2 years, but that with the full expectation that if they have decided they want to practice their science, if you will, in a foreign policy environment, that we're prepared to bring them in, mentor them, and have them complete a career. But we're also expecting that some percentage of those individuals will want to come into the international arena, help shape the international set of norms and standards that are being developed around things like space exploration and cybersecurity and other issues. And then, let's say in 2, 3, 5 years, then take that government policymaking experience back into the private sector or academia, and parlay that into bigger salaries. And we think that's an okay outcome as well. If we can borrow their skill sets when they're very fresh and new in a way that our graduates will not be bringing to the table in the same way, that carving out a small niche for them is, again, a way to keep us very agile. And then the third piece is training people. We hope to make everyone sort of basically literate in, AI. We'll want some people to develop a real fluency, if you will, if I can use language skills as an analogy. And then maybe a few people who can go out and do details, working in Silicon Valley, working in academia, to develop a more detailed expertise. But again, we recognize that for most of us, having some amount of generalized knowledge will be sufficient.
Thank you. I'm looking at the time and I'm hoping we can squeeze 2 more questions in because there are really a lot of good questions. So the next one actually comes from Ambassador Barbara Stevenson, who was one of AFSA's previous presidents. And Ambassador Stevenson said that she was a first-gen kid who didn't have those kinds of possibilities for that lifestyle, and then went on to have a great career. Can you speak to the question of how to mitigate the adverse impact of giving points for living and working abroad?
Well, can I just say, we're looking at a whole series of adverse impacts, right? As soon as you change a process like an intake, you want to make sure by correcting for one thing like accessibility, you're not creating adverse impact elsewhere. So I do want to assure your audience, Nadja, that our recruiters and our board of examiners are constantly checking on whether or not we are creating adverse impact. What I love about the new formula is that you don't have to have one characteristic from column A and one from column B. If living and working overseas, which a striking number of our entry level have now done, then that can count. But let's say you're a heritage speaker of a language and you've never lived in that country, that can count. We aren't giving favor, if you will, to any one factor, but by adding up, the more of those factors you have, or the more we're in need of a particular factor, the more that helps you advance. So, for example, if you're a Russian, a Chinese, or an Arabic speaker, those are very specific skills. We don't find them commonly. So if you have those skills, they count for quite a bit. But in the same way, the goal is not to disadvantage people who haven't lived and worked overseas like you. Until I was an intern, the sum total of my travel had been Tijuana, Mexico, and Montreal, Canada. So by those standards, I wouldn't have made it into the service. So the idea is not to give so much weight to any one factor, but rather to see what the cumulative impact is. And again, it's not just about being specifically related to the Foreign Service. If you have taught, if you have managed, budgets on a reservation, if you have, fill in the blank, we're looking for that variety of experience that, when taken as contributing to a community's worth, a post's worth, an office's worth of experience, that what you're going to bring to the table as a new hire is additive or reinforcing to skills we already have on the table. Okay.
And one last question that I I think you will like, which is, this is for the students in our audience. What is your best advice to students who are looking toward a future in the Foreign Service?
What I would say is, and I say this to every student actually, and that is that, first of all, pursue what interests you. I promise you that whatever field of study you're interested in, we can use the skills you're going to gain from that field of study. If you pursue something that you think is the right course or the right major, but it doesn't interest you, you're not going to do as well. You won't be as inspired. Better to come to us inspired, having learned, having found ways to apply your knowledge, even while you were still in school, in terms of the kinds of activities you volunteered for, or worked on while you were on summer break, or or you took a gap year. Secondly, I always say it's really important to have goals. I had set a very firm goal, as I told you all at the outset. I was going to be a teacher in the DoD school system. And when that plan A fell through, thank goodness Procter & Gamble was there to offer me a free dinner. I would have never thought I would end up working in a factory. But I will tell you this, I applied to Georgetown as a graduating senior and did not get in. When I reapplied, after about a year and a half working for Procter & Gamble, they accepted me the second time around. So I'm a big fan of Plan Bs, or taking advantage of opportunities that you couldn't have anticipated, but that come your way, in some cases for serendipitous reasons. I want to assure all of the students out there that whatever you choose to study, we didn't even talk about, we have 5 general career tracks, but we now have 22 specific specialties. We have doctors and psychiatrists and medical lab technicians. We have financial management officers. They used to let history majors like me manage the budgets. Not a great idea. Now we have financial management officers who do that. We have construction engineers. So if living and working overseas and contributing to our foreign affairs and the strength of our ability to represent the American people overseas interests you, I guarantee you there are a multitude of different things that you can study and develop skills in that we can use. So please go to state.gov for government and go to our careers tab and see the different offerings, and then figure out, again, what excites you, pursue that, and then come to us.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thanks to everyone who submitted these really excellent questions. I'm sorry we could not get through all of them. So that's it for us in terms of the audience questions. I will turn it back to Tom for final words. Thank you.
Sure. All I want to say is, Ambassador Bernicat, thank you so much for joining us, for participating, for sharing your thoughts on a whole host of issues as we celebrate this centennial year of both the Foreign Service and of AFSA. And we're going to see you again. I know in the month of May, that's our big month coming up. So again, thank you for all you do. Thank you for taking the time to share again your thoughts with us, and thank you to our audience. We had a great participation from our audience across the board, not only members but those outside of AFSA. So we really appreciate this. We got some really good ideas too.
Yes,
we'll think about, get back to you. So again, thanks everybody for a great meeting together, and enjoy the solar eclipse, which is coming very soon.
Here, here. And thank you all, if I can echo Tom, for your interest. And it is truly an incredible honor to serve our presidents and especially our citizens in this way. So I hope we've interested a whole new group of people in considering service. You can join up to age 60, by the way.
That's great. Anyway, thanks everybody, and we'll hope to see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.